In 1998, we were introduced to one of the most deceptively adorable platformers on the PlayStation 1, and subsequently, one of the most memorable platformers on the system. Directed by Hideo Yoshizawa, previously involved with the Ninja Gaiden series, Klonoa Door to Phantomile follows the tale of the titular Klonoa and his friend Yupo as they travel across the world fueled by dreams called Phantomile to save it from the dark spirit Gaudius. A delightfully cheerful game with upbeat music, great characters, and a heartfelt story to back it all up. Upon release, Klonoa became critically acclaimed for being one of Namco's most notable platformers, and a good contender for becoming Namco's new mascot character. Critics praised how the game managed to build upon simple controls and maneuvers to make for interesting gameplay, and the bright, colorful visuals of the FMV cutscenes received a lot of praise as well. However, at the time, a lot of people seemed to think that the game's cuteness came at a detriment to the game's audience, being mostly geared towards children, which, in all fairness, Namco did openly state during the game's development. But cute and child-friendly doesn't mean that the game pulls any punches in its narrative, and that's one of the qualities that has left a lasting impression on me when I first played it a good 19 to 20 years ago. It has a story to tell, and it will tell it in the way it wants to tell it, leaving for a memorable experience, which is something that I find that few platformers do. There will be a lot of spoilers for the game's story in this video, so if you want to experience this gem as fresh as it can be, this might not be the one, since I'll be running you through the entire thing, as the story is one of the main reasons why I found this game so enjoyable. Klonoa Door to Phantomile tells the story of Klonoa and his adventures in the mysterious world of Phantomile, which is fueled by the very dreams of its people. As a result, no one can remember what dreams they have had. However, Klonoa, who lives in the town of Breezegill with his grandfather, has been having dreams about a mysterious dark airship crashing into a nearby mountain, and can recall every detail of it. The game opens up with Klonoa running through the woods as an object crashes down. On investigation, Klonoa pulls out the object, which is the ring used throughout the game, and alongside releasing Yupo, the ring spirit. A little time passes and we see the both of them having a grand time across a field when another object crashes into a mountain in the background, to which Klonoa jots awake from his dream. Looking out of the window, he sees the same object crash into the mountain, and this sets off the events of the game. In an effort to find out what crashed into the mountain, they make their way to the Breezegill Bell Hill. Making their way through Breezegill, we get our first introduction to the game's simple yet effective control scheme, accompanied by the iconic whistles of the windmill song. After making their way to the mountain, they meet the stonemason Baloo, who tells them about the statue he carved into the side of the mountain to show his love for the mythical singing diva Laphise. After this encounter, we move onward through a mine shaft and the first real usage of the 2.5D, with various paths intertwining with each other as you travel to the top of the mountain. Here we find a mysterious tall creature, the dark spirit Gaudius, and a small round jester, Joka, alongside Laphise, who gets taken away shortly after. After eavesdropping on the pair, we learn that Gaudius and Joka are intending to use Laphise's pendant to revive the Moon Kingdom, to envelop the world of Phantomile into darkness. Before taking Laphise away, Gaudius orders Joka to dispose of the rats and leaves. It's at this point that we face our first boss of the game, a plant-like creature named Rongolongo, that primarily uses his tail as a means to attack and move around. A relatively simple fight, but nonetheless effective at introducing us to the various mechanics we'll have to deal with later in the game. Having defeated the minion that Joka sends after you, Klonoa finds that the pendant that Gaudius was after was hidden in the bell, after which he returns home to ask Grandpa about it, who tells him that Granny might know more, and that she is currently in the Forest Kingdom of Forlock. Setting off into the Forest Kingdom as well as the second stage of the game, we start to see more of the paths crossed in the level design, and we also get introduced to a plethora of new enemies. On reaching the river that leads to the sacred tree, we're told that something has happened to the water, and the trees are withering and the boats don't reach Granny, because something is blocking the water further upstream, causing the rivers to dry up, and that the answer might lie in the Water Kingdom. Setting off to the Water Kingdom of Jogpot, we see the waterfalls flowing backwards up the mountain, cutting off the water for the forest. After reaching a castle, Klonoa and Yupo free a fish-like creature called Carol, who tells them about two bad men doing something to the castle and that something was wrong with his mother. Setting out to help Carol and ultimately restore the flow of water in Jugpot, they find out that the king, Seedoff, has been corrupted by Gaudius and Joka and is now using Carol's mother, Pamela, as a weapon. After defeating the king and Pamela, they regain their senses and the flow of water is restored, thus saving the forest and allowing Klonoa to use the boats to reach Granny up at the sacred tree. When Carol brings them back to Forlock, we find that the trees are now back to health and the rivers are once again flowing. Making our way to the top of the tree, we find Granny being threatened by Joka to reveal everything she knows about the Moon Kingdom. When our heroes arrive, Joka sends another big plant-like monster after them to get rid of them. This boss has the unique property that it can only be hit from above, so Klonoa will have to fetch enemies and use springboards to hop over it and throw enemies into it. While the game already teaches you a lot about the various properties of the enemies you have to defeat, it really likes to do that through these types of bosses to introduce you to the mechanics that you'll encounter from this point onward. After derooting the creature, Granny tells the two of them about the Moon Kingdom, a land where the forgotten dreams go, and that the Moon Pendant is the key to make said kingdom rise once more. Granny also reveals that it needs to be hidden well, for it might spell doom and gloom for Phantomile if it falls into the wrong hands. After which, Joka shows himself, having listened in on the conversation right before he sets off to Breezegill. Understanding that Grandpa might be in grave danger, Klonoa and Yubo rush off through the dangerous ruins of the Winged Kingdom as a means of shortcut to get there faster. Traversing the ruins, we're accompanied by ghosts, new jumping puzzles and abstract jazzy music playing in the background with returning leitmotifs of the Breezegill levels. I can't help but feel that the ethereal vibes coming off this area are accompanied by a sense of melancholy. The ruins are riddled with ghostly enemies and skeletons of large creatures. This vision is also the turning point for the gameplay to become more challenging, and setting up for tighter jumps, more complex maneuvers, and more enemies condensed in smaller areas to make your way through. After making our way past water slides, windy turbines, and ribcage jumping, we finally reach the end of the cave, and step out to find Grandpa to wave at Klonoa. As we step out from the ruins, the atmosphere changes, and the music fades out as, well, this happens. A stunned Klonoa is left watching helplessly as the Moon Pendant is taken away from the ruins of his home. Word for his grandpa, he rushes off straight into the next boss fight, a giant dragonfly-shaped creature. I particularly love this fight due to how unique the fight feels in contrast to the rest of the game's bosses. Rocking back and forth on the bridge, you grab the enemies to throw at the colored spots, dodging obstacles that the boss places. The music itself also stands out a bit, as there is a sense of urgency in the melody, somewhat mirroring the story beat. After beating the boss, we find that Grandpa was gravely injured by the blast, and in his last moments. As Klonoa lets out a heartbroken cry, as Grandpa lets out his last breath, The screen slowly fades to black. I said earlier that this game does not withhold any punches, and this was one of the moments I was referring to. A moment of utter defeat and loss, handled in such a beautifully tragic way. Klonoa sounding devastated in comparison to his usual cheery self. Even Yupo sounds distraught at this moment. The scene carries a heavy weight, and the game lets you really take in this moment. It juxtaposes the rest of the game's cheerful and dreamy atmosphere, and sinks its teeth into you. As a kid, this was one of the first moments I've ever stopped for a good 30 minutes to stare at my TV, with mouth agape in pure awe and disbelief at the turn of events. In the wake of this scene, Pamela comes flying in to take Klonoa and Yupo to the Temple of the Sun, which is high up in the sky. Here we meet the Sun Temple soldiers who beg for Klonoa's help, since the followers of Gaudius locked him out of the temple and they're too scared to even try fighting. So we're off to help once more, this time to gather 4 orbs to place on the pedestals in what is one of my favorite levels in the game. You're weaving back and forth along multiple paths to solve various puzzles and unlock the ways to the orbs. It's just an incredible amount of fun to see how well this level is connected and how well they use the backgrounds and foregrounds in this. After we place the orbs back in place, the door to the altar opens and we dive into what is maybe the most thematic level in the game. Traversing the side of the Temple of the Sun, the entire area constantly switches from light to dark, changing the dream into a nightmare, with new and stronger enemies to avoid. The changing from light to dark is not something that hasn't been done before, but I find it fascinating how well it ties into the theme, the corruption of Gaudius' work slowly overtaking Phantomile. After a long sequence of jump puzzles, avoiding ghosts and whatnot, we finally reach the elevator leading Klonoa to the top of the temple and right into the hands of Joka, who at this point is quite ready to prove his worth as Gaudius' minion. Here we finally learn of Gaudius' ulterior motive. Revenge for being a forgotten dream, and to exact that revenge, he has taken Lafis to open the Moon Kingdom and unleash all the forgotten dreams upon the world, plunging Phantomile into eternal nightmare. The ascent to the Temple of the Sun has some thematically fitting motifs to it, but when I played this for the video, I noticed that the Joka fight elevates this motif and incorporates that in a fantastic way into the fight's mechanics. As you're fighting him, the sun starts setting slowly in the background as the powers of the nightmare take hold of the stage, and when they do, Joka transforms from a round jester into this turtle dragon creature. And it's your job to bring the light back into the stage by lighting up all the tiles once more. The fight with Joka buys Gaudius enough time to use the pendant to revive the Moon Kingdom. As the kingdom rises to the sky, the nightmares start pouring over Phantomile. So, it is up to our heroes and Pamela to go to the Moon Kingdom to put a stop to that once and for all. What follows is one of the longest levels in the game. A long ascent to the top of the Moon Kingdom where you have to open up various doorways to progress, complete difficult jumping puzzles, and slowly get to the top of the tower. Including one of my favorite segments where you have to hop over a series of small platforms whilst being chased, and have to catch an enemy mid-air to use as a jump extender. An incredibly satisfying segment. After clearing this sequence and making your way halfway up, we meet the Queen of the Moon Kingdom, who tells us that Gaudius trapped Lafis in an egg, and is pouring all the energy from nightmares into it. It's also revealed that Yupo was the Prince of the Moon Kingdom all along, and that he inhabited the ring to have a reason to be in the outside world. Reasons which he can't reveal until later. Leading to the most wholesome exchange of Klonoa just shaking Yupo's hand telling him, "We've been friends forever, right?" Sending us off to the final stretch of the game, the climb to the top, to the final confrontation with Gaudius. For as menacing as Gaudius is throughout the story, the final confrontation leaves a disappointing aftertaste. He is always depicted as this gigantic embodiment of evil, with a low, heavily distorted voice that only strengthens his presence and makes him stand out against the rest of the game's characters. Always standing out as a big evil presence looming over the game and coming across as a good villain, with a motive that seems rather petty but also understandable. Him being bitter about being forgotten and all, only to end up being tossed around by his own minions. This fight feels incredibly underwhelming if looking at only the gameplay. However, I do find the design of the arena, as well as getting treated to more of his voice clips, a real treat. Seeing the vortex of nightmares swirling around him, as well as the void in his cape, make for a rather spectacular looking fight. But the game isn't over just yet. With Gaudius defeated, he reveals that the nightmare energy has already taken over Luffy's, and that the true final boss, Nahatum, is about to be born. And this is probably my only gripe with the game. Nahatum is a very underutilized entity and character throughout the game, and only gets mentioned once or twice as sort of an afterthought to the story. They make up for that and the underwhelming Gaudius fight, however, by making this boss one of the coolest looking things in the game. Nahatum's confrontation is divided into 3 major phases, each seemingly representing the stages of a nightmare taking hold. First, the introduction to the nightmare, then the absorption into the nightmare, and finally, the embodiment of the nightmare. Fighting it off in the first phase requires you to fill up the cannons of each of the kingdom's representatives, having them band together to fire it in unison, as the only thing that can beat him is their combined power. It gives a lot more meaning behind the other characters showing up near the end, as well as emphasizing just how strong this literal embodiment of nightmares really is. After clearing the first phase, Klonoa gets gobbled up by Nahatum and is thrown into a vortex of nightmares. In here, Nahatum takes the shape of a distorted creepy face with 4 eyes, and it is one of the coolest sequences in the game. Defeating this phase causes the boss to regurgitate Klonoa and spit him back into the arena for the final stretch of the game, where all the different mechanics of the various bosses unite for a final showdown. Once again, having to charge the cannons, we're now dealing with platforms being destroyed, armored enemies, and a variation of moves from the boss to dodge. With one final blast, Nahatum is nearly destroyed, and to seal the deal, Yupo decides to sacrifice himself as the last shot to kill this monster. Now, Laphise is released from the clutches of the nightmare. To much fanfare, the rest of the characters gathered around, including a rather emotional Walu. Klonoa is off to the side, lamenting the loss of his friend as a weakened Yupo reappears and everyone is reunited in the end. During the final sequence, Laphise is getting ready to sing the Song of Rebirth to renew the world. As we see Klonoa and Yupo sit together on top of the statue Baloo carved into the mountain. As they talk about their time together and how they'll always be able to visit each other, Yupo tells Klonoa that the strange dream that Gaudius spoke of was Klonoa himself, that he is a dream that Yupo called to Phantomile from another world to restore the balance. That his memories were something that was implanted into him by Yupo, and that once Laphise sings her Song of Rebirth, Klonoa won't be able to stay in this world, leading to one of the most heartfelt, sudden, and devastating final goodbyes. Hideo Yoshizawa's influence is very evident throughout the game's gameplay. Having tight controls and a simple button scheme to go along with it, the game heavily relies on the player using these tools to traverse the environment. Using enemies as jump extensions, projectiles, or switch triggers that are out of the wind bullet's reach. Having previously worked on the original Ninja Gaiden trilogy on the NES as a director, there is a certain level of refinement that shines through from these games into Klonoa, albeit in a less brutal and punishing form. With the initial levels being designed as a way to familiarize the player with the way the game is supposed to be played, the game quickly ramps up the obstacle courses to traverse, but never overshoots itself in this regard. The first few stages are pretty lax, with very few pitfalls or dense rows of enemies to maneuver around, but this all quickly changes in the second set of stages. Vision 2, to force the forelock, starts to introduce enemies that can only be hit from the rear, enemies that have hitboxes that only appear during certain moments of their movement patterns, and enemies that can't be hit altogether. It very much feels like a progression in difficulty, however it also feels very gradual throughout the game's runtime. Despite being a challenging game, it also feels very fair and rewarding, in part due to how simple yet incredibly responsive the control scheme is. Klonoa's controls are simple. You have a jump button and a fire button. Your friend Yupo inhabits the ring Klonoa carries, and you can fire him out of the ring to inflate enemies called a wind bullet, which you can then use to increase the height of your jumps by throwing it down or use them as an offensive projectile to hurl at enemies. Enemies will also have different properties to them, such as being able to carry you upward with a little propeller or exploding after being thrown, turning most enemies into tools to traverse objects rather than just obstacles. The simplicity of the control scheme gets deceptively more difficult throughout the game as you have to bob and weave through various obstacles using these tools to make your way through. Taking full advantage of the 2.5D design, you can fire Yupo at enemies or fire said enemies into the forward background by pressing up or down as you shoot. The further you get into the game, the more you have to make use of this, even having a few bosses fully designed around the idea of using the forward background. One of these bosses, as previously mentioned, has you fighting on a bridge that swings back and forth, and you have to take an enemy through the boss's traps to actually hit him. Overall though, it's a combination of the simplicity of the controls and the way the levels are intuitively designed around these two buttons that makes Klonoa so easy to pick up and enjoy. It feels fulfilling to go from figuring out how to make the most out of enemies and their properties, to being able to catch an enemy mid-air to create an extra jump height to reach a platform, or a taunting gesture with a key that opens the door further inside a level. Klonoa strikes a rare balance in teaching the player how to play the game, while never explicitly telling you how to. If a new enemy or situation gets introduced, it usually shows you in a relatively safe manner. No pitfalls or swarms of ghosts to harm you, while you take your time to figure out how to get to a ledge. Whenever a new method is taught to get from point A to point B, the game will start to slowly introduce those in the form of more dangerous obstacles. Jumping over a long pit using only enemies, extending your jump height to reach a platform with spikes flying in between them, or extending your jump multiple times by grabbing enemies as you go. It's a really enjoyable curve that gets maintained throughout, and the levels are all satisfyingly built around this. One of my favorite moments is a previously mentioned tight jump sequence in Vision 6 where you're chased by enemies hopping over the same small platforms. At the end you have to catch an enemy mid-air and extend your jump height with it to reach the exit. In short, the gameplay feels snappy, responsive, and the levels are well constructed around the tools you're given. And the game is very easy to pick up and just play because of this. There are only a few games that manage to captivate the attention of the player within the first second of the game's start for me, and Klonoa certainly manages to draw you into the world of Phantomile from the get-go. The cheery song that the game opens up with, accompanied by beautiful visuals and sprite work, every character pops off the screen and leaves a memorable impression, and that is a very difficult thing to achieve in a game with a runtime of about 4 to 6 hours. From the idol otaku mason who sculpted a mountain into his favorite idol, to the weird designs of the bosses, each character offers something to the game as a whole, be it narratively or as a bloated jumping platform. And in part, that's why I wanted to pay more attention to retelling the story of the game earlier in the video. I had never experienced a platformer as rich as Klonoa. The story was easily the most memorable part of the game as it was told so well. Now that I'm older and have a better understanding of it, as well as a better grasp on the English language, I still find a lot of new details that make an already great experience even better. When playing this as a kid, a lot of the reference to strange dreams went right over my head, and now I just appreciate the game even more for catching up on these details. Klonoa Door to Phantomile manages to capture that childlike imagination that never fails to put a smile on my face. It's cheerful, colorful, and full of lively visuals. Klonoa's signature is something that always stuck with me and still gets a goofy smirk every once in a while. The whole game feels like an adventure, and the story is there to back it up until the very end. For a platformer at the time, it offered a lot more to think about than I was used to, and looking at it now, I think a lot of it has to do with how well the story complements the game. A great adventure through and through that is not afraid to invoke some feelings from the player. Rich and lovable characters, colorful locations and enemies, the game provides endless things to look at with its beautiful sprite work, all backed up by a fantastic soundtrack composed by Kanako Kakino. Getting a copy of Klonoa Door to Phantomile can be a bit of a struggle, however, since the game fetches a somewhat high price on the market, but luckily the game is available as a PS Classic title on the PS Store, at least here in Europe. When I started working on this video, I originally intended to make a very short form review on Klonoa. But as I started writing the script for it, I started to realize that this game in particular was something that I wanted to spend more time on, and talk a bit more in depth about the game, the story, and the music. It felt like a much more challenging undertaking than I originally anticipated because, in a lot of ways, Klonoa Door to Phantomile had a lasting impact on how I'd view games from that point forward. Coming from platformers like Crash, Spyro, Pandemonium, and Mario 64, this game would break away from the more lighthearted tones of these games and really manage to captivate me with its story in particular. In the end, I just wanted to make this video as an excuse to talk a bit about Klonoa. It hasn't left me for 2 decades, and it is something special that I frequently revisit, with a big, albeit somewhat sad smile.